if you look at training on preaching, what you'll find is that typically what we're looking at tonight is actually often missing. And so the idea of the importance of the emotions in preaching, there's stuff written about it, but again, it's very lacking. So I want to start with some things that will help you realize the importance of the emotions. And the kind of first thing I want to say is I want to contrast sort of a Stoicism versus an embodied theology. Essentially, this will make sense in a moment, our approach to preaching sometimes can be more Stoic than Christian. And so sometimes as preachers, the approach is, if I just get people to think the right way, then all of life will flow from how a person thinks, right? Kind of, how's that working out? Like we produce disciples that are good at thinking, but are lacking in every other area of life. And then we think that a great disciple is someone who's got a rigorous Bible study plan. And that's not bad, but then we read things like Jesus was a friend to tax collectors and sinners, and realize that his faith, his living out the Christian life was far more than just having a good Bible study plan. And so if we think about a person's emotional or relational life, we quickly realize that our metrics for discipleship are weak. And the Christian view of anthropology, if you think about what we are as people, it's not just that you are a mind and everything flows from your mind. Instead, the Christian view of anthropology is that you comprise many parts that all work together and are interdependent on each other. And so when we read things like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, often our approach in preaching is just mind and strength. Here's what to think, now go do it. And we miss heart and soul. And so what about the heart and soul? Better, how do we address the heart so that our effort is natural and we can save our will for where we need it? By the way, sometimes this gets conflated as though will isn't part of the Christian life. It is. Sanctification definitely includes effort. But at the same time, ideally what happens is that God is also changing the heart so that things come naturally. Right? And so, to put it another way, a person might sit under your sermon and have plenty to think about, but what they really need sometimes is something that addresses their emotions. These things should be working together, okay? I remember once I was at Oak Hills Christian College, and there was this group that was like, it was a philosophy group. And it was just this kind of thing that you could join, and there's a lot of the professors were part of the group, and some of the students, and we would discuss philosophy. And there was one session where this guy comes in, and he shares, it's kind of like, well, what's the topic for today? What are we going to talk about? And the guy shares something that literally is bringing him to tears as he shares it. And what was interesting to me is that we then spent the next 45 minutes with people throwing out philosophical paradigms that didn't really address what that man was going through. And he left frustrated. Like he left with all these ideas, but nothing that really addressed the emotions. Nothing really addressed practically what he was feeling. And so we're made with emotions, and stewarding our emotions is an important part of our discipleship. And if our preaching doesn't connect with the emotions of those hearing, then it's harder for them, more difficult for them to live it out. Something I really enjoy that connects with this in an interesting way. I enjoy reading books on behavioral economics, just because I find it so interesting. They do one study after another that usually shows, the pattern is like, it shows that we think we're rational creatures, but often we decide with our emotions, which we later rationalize, right? And so, for example, you might get a free thing for a free cup of coffee at Starbucks. And you might drive all the way into town to get your cup of coffee from Starbucks, and you've saved yourself 3 pounds or something, okay, right? And you're happy with yourself, and it feels good, and whatever. And then fast forward, you're like buying a car, and you're going to spend 10,000 pounds on that car. And you could travel to somewhere like London or something, and save 1,000 pounds, but boy, that would take a lot of time. Now, think of the time that you traveled to save 3 pounds, multiply that by 300 times. Traveling to London is nothing, right? And yet, we don't do the calculation that way. See, what we do is the emotional thing of getting something for free and whatever will take us well out of our way, and so what they'll do is they'll set up experiments, one after another, that just show again and again that we aren't as rational as we think we are. The emotions, like we're far more complicated than that. And then when we come back to preaching, actually then when people are listening, really people want you to communicate on an emotional level. People appreciate emotion, it's engaging, it helps attention span. When there's no emotion, it's boring. Now, at the same time, overly emotional or fake is harmful, and I'm going to come back to that because that's important. Now, by the way, it's worth recognizing something in this. I feel like culturally, at one point in culture, that the emotions were ignored. Now our culture has made emotions king, and the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? But people generally want you to engage the emotions. Often emotion shows that you actually believe what you're saying. And so emotions shouldn't be driving the sermon, but they shouldn't be ignored either. And there could be as well, worth recognizing that, and I'm speaking to lots of us in lots of different places, but a fear of showing emotion is often rooted in pride. And so it might be good for us even to connect with our own emotions if we're going to preach well. Okay? Now, there's a precedent for this. Like throughout Scripture, you've actually got lots of examples, lots of biblical examples of people showing emotion. Jeremiah was known as I think I put some of these in your notes. Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet. Paul said he preached with trembling. He also says he warned with tears, Acts 20:31. So be on your guard. Remember that for 3 years I never stopped warning each of you night and day with tears. Right? Like preachers in the Bible often used emotional language as well. Like I like when Paul at one point says, I'm not, how does he say it? It says essentially that he hasn't held back in sharing the gospel so that he doesn't have the blood of anyone on his hands. That is incredibly emotional language, right? Or think of things like Jesus overturning the tables in the temple. So I think what I want to highlight right now is two opposite pitfalls. Of course, what we should be aiming for is in between these, but we can learn from these. So two opposite pitfalls. The first would be too strongly connecting with emotions, or essentially manipulation. And so essentially, like most of us need to know how to better connect with the emotions. Some people out there need to be careful not to go too far, okay? Now, likely that's not a common problem, but it's a good one to learn from. And so there's a caution here not to overdo connecting with the emotions. I want to help you connect with people's emotions, but it needs to be toward the right end and done in the right way, okay? And so there's lots of questions people have around this, like, is it okay to play music in the background while someone speaks, right? When does persuasion become manipulation? I found this interesting when I was an intern. We were given a book to read. It's going back a long ways. One of the books we were given to read, again, complicated, is by Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Right? And the whole book is basically about how you can make people like you by giving them compliments. Like if I were to summarize the book. And you kind of go, is that ministry? Is that okay? Is that how we should operate? Right? Or, I remember as a young Christian, the church where I became a Christian was a church of like 2,000 people, okay? And the guy who had started it was a fantastic guy, like Doyle Van Gelder. He was a carpenter when God called him, a dyslexic carpenter, went on to get his doctorate, do some mission work, start a church in the basement of a company that then became this 2,000-member church, okay? But, and I share this with great respect for Doyle Van Gelder. Like, love the man to bits. but there would be three services on a Sunday, and quite often you'd get to the end of the service, and there'd be a point, and you'd kind of slow down, and then he'd, start crying, and you kind of like, it's always at the same place in the sermon, right? But then there was something else, though. The mood in the room would change. I just want to take you into the complexity of this. The mood in the room would change. People would respond, and if you, like, when my wife wants to cheer up sometimes, she might watch videos of, like, laughing babies, right? Because then we feel the emotion, or similarly, we feel that we empathize. There's something, so he would choke up and he would start crying, and he would start speaking about what he'd been talking about, and all of a sudden it would land with people in an entirely different way. And at first, I was good with it. And then there was times where I was sitting there going, in the back of my head going, this feels forced. Because you're going to choke up and cry at the exact same point at the next service and the service after that. And so what I really want, because this can be very dangerous, if it feels false, you can ruin your reputation, or even the reputation of the church, or the reputation of Christianity. Right? Dangerous. And so I want it to be genuine. And so is it helpful and powerful to connect with your own emotions in a sermon? Yes, definitely. We don't want to overdo it. We don't want it to be manipulation, but it can be actually very, very important and helpful for people. As I say, and in that, this gets tricky. For example, if you give the same sermon several times, sometimes I give the same sermon sometimes 5 times, right? And there's those bits that were really funny that don't land, and there's the bits where you feel emotional and it shows, and then you give them the same sermon again, and it's just not showing second time around because you've just done it. And we have to accept that, I think. Most likely, people will see through. People are very good at trying to intuit. Like even me as a young Christian going, hold on, something doesn't feel right here. People are good at intuiting what they feel like is true or false. And again, we need to be really careful about that. And last thing I'll say around that kind of manipulation side of things, and it's something to be aware of because it's easy to do, I would really want the way you speak in front of people to be the way you'd speak with a group of friends. Right? Again, dear man who's gone to be with the Lord, had a great ministry, friend, but one thing I found really awkward is whenever he would get up to speak in front of a group of people, he would all of a sudden go Old English on you. Like it was a different tone, it was a different anything that he would, and yet because he was respected and because he was a lovely man, people accepted it. And I don't think it was malicious in any way, but I feel like his ministry would have been more powerful if it was him. Because when you talk to him, it was so much better. You know what I mean? And so, again, that's something very important in developing our ability to speak in front of people so that it lines up with who we are in front of people or not. And so one pitfall to avoid is too strongly connecting with emotions. Another pitfall to avoid, however, on the other end of things, is too weakly communicating with emotions, or not at all. And sometimes I think that happens as a corrective to what I've already been talking about, right? I love this quote that I want to share with you just because it's from Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. And I read some of his stuff sometimes and I go, well, it doesn't feel like he's typically like an emotional preacher. And yet, listen to what he says here. He says, to use a term that is common today, the preacher must never be clinical. So often the preacher is. Everything he does is right, is indeed almost perfect, but it is not. It is clinical, it is not living. It is cold, it is not moving, because the man has not been moved himself, or woman, of course. But that should not be true of the preacher. If the preacher really believes what he is saying, he must be moved by it. It is impossible for him not to be. This leads to the warmth of necessity, to warmth of necessity. The Apostle Paul tells us himself that he preached with tears. He reminded the Ephesian elders that in Acts 20:19. And he refers to certain false preachers in Philippians 3. He says he does so with weeping. Now, the Apostle Paul was a giant intellect, one of the masterminds of the centuries, but he often wept as he spoke and preached. He was often moved to tears. Where has this notion come from that you are a great intellect, that if you are a great intellect, you show no emotion? How ridiculous and fatuous it is. A man who is not moved by these things, I maintain, has never really understood them. Right? You get the idea of what he's saying there. I want to pause here and give you a chance for a little bit in groups. And so right now, just to think about this, like I put some questions on there, like how do you know, or when have you seen this sort of manipulation or the opposite, these various pitfalls? And then similarly, where have you recognized kind of the importance of emotions and the importance of emotion in preaching? And so go ahead and talk for a few minutes and then we'll pull back together. Go for it.